I didn't cheat because I wanted to win. That's the version of the story people expect. It's cleaner, easier to swallow. The truth is, I cheated because I realized the game was watching me. Not the cards, not the money. The game. There's a moment on the road when you feel it for the first time, a quiet shift in the air, like something unseen has leaned closer, like you've been noticed not for what you did, but for who you are becoming. That's when the rules start to change. 2 weeks earlier, still believed poker was something you played. I believed lines existed, that there was a right way to lose and a wrong way to win. I believed that if you kept your hands clean, the road would respect you. But hunger has a way of rewriting beliefs. So does silence. Oklahoma City didn't announce itself when I arrived. No grand skyline, no sense of arrival, just rain-dark streets, flickering lights, and buildings that looked like they'd seen too much to bother judging anyone anymore. I was tired, not just physically, existentially tired, the kind of exhaustion that settles behind your eyes and makes every decision feel heavier than it should. I remember sitting in my car, engine off, listening to the ticking sound as the metal cooled. That sound felt louder than it should have, like a countdown. I didn't know it yet, but that night would divide my life into 2 parts. Before I crossed the line, and after I realized how easy it was. The game I would later cheat in wasn't special. No high rollers, no famous names, just men who had learned how the world really works, and had stopped pretending otherwise. That's what made it dangerous. Because the most dangerous tables aren't filled with monsters. They're filled with men who look just like you, except they've already accepted the truth. I watched them before I ever sat down. That was new. Before, I watched cards, odds, movements. Now, I watched intent. Who was relaxed because they felt safe? Who was tense because they felt watched? Who didn't care if they lost? And who absolutely couldn't afford to? That's when I felt it again. That quiet pressure. Like a hand resting lightly on the back of my neck. You see, the road teaches you something brutal if you stay on it long enough. You're never as invisible as you think. Every town remembers something. Every table remembers faces. And every decision leaves a shadow. I sat there, staring through the windshield, knowing that if I played the way I always had, I would lose. Not dramatically, not all at once. I would simply fade. Run out of money, run out of places, run out of excuses. And in that moment, I understood something that scared me more than cheating ever could. The game wasn't asking if I would cross the line. It was asking when. I wish I could tell you there was panic, or guilt, or some dramatic internal struggle that made me feel heroic for resisting even briefly. There wasn't. There was clarity. A cold, unsettling clarity that settled in my chest and made my breathing slow instead of fast. I realized I wasn't choosing between right and wrong. I was choosing between survival and disappearance. And the most frightening part, the choice didn't feel hard. That's how I knew something bad had already begun. Because when crossing a line feels logical instead of terrifying, you've already crossed another one you can't see. Before I even entered that room, I promised myself something. Not that I would cheat, but that if the moment came, I wouldn't hesitate. That promise followed me inside. It sat with me at the table. It waited patiently while the cards were dealt. And when the opportunity finally appeared, subtle, quiet, almost polite, it didn't feel like temptation. It felt like confirmation. Like the game nodding back at me and saying, "So, you finally understand. Stay with me." Because this is the moment everything stopped being a game. This is the moment where winning stopped being about money and started being about memory. Because I did cheat. And I did win. But the part no one tells you is that the win wasn't the thing that haunted me. It was the look on one man's face when he realized something had changed, even if he couldn't yet explain what. That look comes back later. Much later. And when it does, you'll understand why some victories follow you longer than any loss ever could. After weeks on the road, time stopped behaving the way it should. Days blurred together, not because they were exciting, but because they were empty. Towns passed by without leaving names behind. Just gas stations, diners, and roads that looked the same no matter how far I drove. The radio played voices that felt like they came from another world, cheerful, confident, certain. None of those things applied to me anymore. I was tired, in a way sleep couldn't fix. Not just my body, my thoughts. Every morning, I woke up with the same question pressing quietly against my chest. How much longer can I keep doing this? And every morning, I ignored it, because answering felt more dangerous than pretending it didn't exist. Hunger changes you slowly. At first, it's just discomfort, a dull ache that reminds you to eat. Then it becomes distraction. You stop thinking clearly. You start measuring the world in opportunities instead of values. Eventually, hunger stops being physical at all. It becomes a voice. A whisper that asks what you're willing to trade. I told myself I was still playing poker. But that wasn't true anymore. Poker had become the excuse I used to stay moving, to avoid settling anywhere long enough for people to start asking questions, including myself. I wasn't chasing money. I was chasing continuation, another tank of gas, another night without sleeping hungry, another reason not to turn back. Isolation on the road is quiet at first. No one argues with you. No one challenges your decisions. No one reminds you who you used to be. That silence feels like freedom, until it doesn't. I stopped calling home because I didn't know what I would say. I stopped writing letters because I didn't recognize the man who would have signed them. Conversations became brief, transactional, forgettable. Names didn't matter. Faces blurred together. I was becoming efficient at disappearing. And somewhere between Texas and Oklahoma, I realized something unsettling. No one would stop me from becoming whoever I needed to be. That realization should have felt empowering. Instead, it felt heavy. Because identity isn't something you lose all at once. It erodes, like a road worn down by passing tires slowly, predictably, until you can't remember what it looked like before. At night, alone in the car, I replayed games in my head. Not the wins, the moments, the pauses, the hesitations, the times I folded. Not because I should have, but because I was afraid. Afraid of being seen, afraid of committing, afraid of losing the little control I still believed I had. Pressure doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it just sits with you. It sat with me every time I counted my money and realized how thin the margin had become. Every time I chose gas over food. Every time I stayed an extra hour at a table. Because leaving felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to face. I began to notice how often survival required compromise. Small ones at first. Ignoring a bad feeling. Staying quiet when something felt wrong. Accepting that fairness wasn't guaranteed or even common. Those compromises added up. Not enough to break me. Enough to bend me. I wasn't proud of who I was becoming, but I wasn't ashamed either. Shame requires certainty, and certainty was something the road had taken from me. All I had left was momentum. Keep moving, keep playing, keep surviving. The men I met along the way mirrored that truth back at me. They didn't talk about dreams. They talked about routines, about what worked, about what didn't. Their stories weren't heroic. They were instructional. Listen more than you speak. Never rush a decision, and never assume you're the smartest man in the room. Those lessons stuck. So did the looks. The way some men sized me up when I sat down. Not dismissive, curious, as if they were trying to decide whether I would last or disappear like so many others. That curiosity fed the pressure. I felt like I was being evaluated by something larger than any single table, like the road itself was waiting to see what choice I'd make when the margin finally vanished. By the time I reached Oklahoma City, exhaustion had stripped me down to essentials. I wasn't pretending anymore, not with myself. I knew exactly how close I was to the edge. And I knew that if I played the same way I always had, the outcome wouldn't change. That's the thing about inevitability. You feel it long before it arrives. It settles into your decisions. Make certain paths feel closed, even if they technically aren't. I could have walked away, found work, asked for help, gone home. But those options felt abstract. Survival felt immediate. And survival doesn't wait for permission. Sitting alone in my car that night, staring at the dark streets of a city that didn't care whether I stayed or left, I understood something I'd been avoiding. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about identity. About whether I was willing to adapt or willing to vanish. About whether I was still the kind of man who believed lines mattered, or whether I was becoming the kind of man who learned where they could be bent. I didn't like the answer forming in my mind, but I couldn't deny it. The road had taught me patience, hunger had taught me efficiency, isolation had taught me silence. The next lesson was coming, and it wouldn't be gentle. Because when exhaustion strips away everything unnecessary, what's left isn't always who you hoped you'd be. Sometimes, it's who you need to be to survive. And that realization, more than any loss or win, is what pushed me toward the moment that followed. The moment where watching stopped being enough. The moment where understanding demanded action. The moment where I finally tested how far I was willing to go, and whether the road would let me come back from it. Oklahoma City didn't welcome me. It didn't reject me either. It just watched. Some cities announced themselves with noise, traffic, crowds, ambition spilling out onto the sidewalks. Oklahoma City did the opposite. It stayed quiet, observant, like a man in the corner of the room who never interrupts the conversation, but somehow hears everything. Rain had washed the streets clean of color. Neon signs reflected weakly on the pavement, distorted and broken, like promises no one believed anymore. The air smelled of wet asphalt, tobacco, and something metallic I couldn't quite name. Every city has a pulse. Here, it was slow, deliberate. I felt it the moment I stepped out of the car. The way sound seemed to disappear too quickly. The way people moved without urgency, but never without purpose. No one wasted energy here. Not words, not gestures, not attention. That alone told me enough. The poker games weren't advertised. They never are. They existed the way rumors exist, half-spoken, passed quietly from one mouth to another, always changing shape by the time they reached you. Back of a pool hall, private room behind the bar, ask for the door with no sign. Directions here were never precise. Precision implied trust. Pool halls were everywhere. Long, narrow rooms filled with cigarette smoke and the sharp crack of balls colliding. Men leaned over green, felt with the same posture I'd seen at poker tables across the country, focused, inward, calculating. Games within games. I learned quickly that pool halls weren't about pool. They were about waiting. Waiting for information. Waiting for opportunity. Waiting for someone to make a mistake. The poker rooms hid behind them like secrets behind a smile. The first backroom I saw had no window, just a bare bulb hanging low, casting shadows that clung to the walls. The felt was dark, the chairs uneven, the kind of place where comfort wasn't a priority, awareness was. Smoke hung thick in the air, unmoving, as if the room itself refused to breathe too deeply. Every inhale tasted earned, every exhale felt like a confession. Men sat differently here. They didn't lean forward with excitement. They leaned back with patience. These were men with quiet power, not the loud, demanding kind, but the kind that comes from knowing you don't need to explain yourself to anyone in the room. Men who had learned when silence was more effective than threat. They didn't size you up openly. They absorbed you. Not your clothes, not your money. Your timing, your confidence, your hesitation. I realized something unsettling. Oklahoma City didn't test you immediately. It let you settle first. Let you believe you were unnoticed. Then it decided. Neon signs outside flickered without urgency, as if they had all the time in the world. Rain tapped softly against windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. Music played low in the background, not to entertain, but to fill the silence just enough that it didn't feel suspicious. Silence here wasn't empty. It was listening. Every room felt like it had memory, like the walls had watched men win, lose, argue, disappear, like they recognized patterns before people did. I found myself lowering my voice without realizing it, slowing my movements, waiting longer before acting. The city demanded patience, not politely, but persistently. You didn't rush Oklahoma City. If you did, it punished you by revealing nothing. The men here weren't flashy, no big talk, no exaggerated gestures. Their confidence didn't come from bravado, it came from repetition, from having been in rooms like this long enough to know what usually happened next. They drank slowly. They watched longer. And when they looked at you, it wasn't curiosity. It was assessment. I began to understand why people disappeared here without anyone asking questions. The city didn't need explanations. It kept its own records. There were nights when I walked past a bar and felt eyes follow me from behind darkened windows. Nights when I sat in the car and delayed turning off the engine, just to listen to confirm nothing had changed behind me. That kind of tension doesn't shout. It hums. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The backroom poker games felt like extensions of the city itself. Controlled, contained, quietly dangerous. No shouting when a man lost. No celebration when someone won. Just subtle shifts in posture. A tightening jaw. A look held for a second too long. I noticed how often no one asked questions. Who you were, where you came from, why you were there. Those questions were already answered in other ways. In how you sat ... in how you waited ... in whether you knew when to stop talking. That's when it hit me. Oklahoma City wasn't just a place where things happened. It was a place where things were noticed. Every mistake lingered longer here. Every success echoed quietly. The city didn't forget faces, it cataloged them. I felt like I was walking through a test I hadn't studied for, aware that every step counted even if no one acknowledged it. And that awareness fed something inside me. Pressure. Not the kind that crushes you all at once, the kind that compresses you slowly until you either adapt or crack. By the time I sat at my first table there, I already knew the city wouldn't forgive arrogance. It tolerated confidence, but only the kind backed by restraint. Anything louder than that drew attention. And attention here was expensive. As I moved through pool halls and backrooms, I felt Oklahoma City leaning closer, waiting to see which version of me would survive its rooms. The careful observer, the desperate drifter, or something else entirely. Because cities like this don't challenge you directly. They wait until you challenge yourself. They wait until you believe you understand the game. And then they show you how much you've missed. I didn't know it yet, but Oklahoma City was preparing me. Stripping away assumptions. Slowing me down, teaching me that the real danger wasn't losing money, it was being predictable. The city didn't demand I change. It simply created conditions where staying the same wasn't possible. And somewhere in those smoke-filled rooms, under flickering neon and watchful silence, the next moment was already forming. The moment where observation wouldn't be enough. The moment where the city would stop watching and start remembering. I didn't sit down intending to cross a line. I sat down, intending to understand where it was. That was the difference. The table was already alive when I arrived. Not loud, not animated, just active in the way a room gets when everyone knows why they're there. Chips moved with practiced rhythm. Cards whispered across felt. No one rushed. No one wasted motion. I took my seat and said nothing. Watching had become my habit. My shield, my last advantage. At first, I watched the obvious things: posture, breathing, hands. The patterns that announce themselves if you're patient enough to let them. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized the real information lived elsewhere. It lived in timing. Who acted quickly because they wanted the moment over. Who waited because they enjoyed control. Who filled silence with noise. And who let silence do the work. Patterns emerged quietly, like footprints after rain. One man leaned forward whenever the pot grew uncomfortable. Another tapped his fingers when he believed no one was paying attention. A third never touched his drink until a hand was over, as if celebration itself required permission. I wasn't judging them. I was learning their language. That's when the pressure returned. Not sudden, not dramatic, just present. The knowledge that my margin was thin, that my money wouldn't last forever, that patience alone wouldn't feed me if the night turned against me. Fear whispered first, "Don't risk it, play clean, survive another night." Pride answered quickly, "You're smarter than this, you've learned enough, you don't need shortcuts." And beneath both of them, quieter than either, necessity waited. Necessity doesn't argue. It observes. It points out facts without emotion. The cost of gas, the weight of hunger, the way tomorrow looks less forgiving than yesterday. It doesn't push you. It lets you arrive on your own. As the hands passed, I felt myself changing, not externally, but internally. I was no longer just reacting. I was anticipating, seeing possibilities before they fully formed. That scared me. Because awareness is addictive. Once you start noticing patterns, it's hard to ignore the opportunities they create. Harder still to pretend you don't see the gaps, the small spaces, where rules rely on trust more than enforcement. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself it wasn't worth it. But the table kept talking. Not in words, in rhythm. In moments when no one looked, in pauses that lasted a fraction too long, in movements that assumed no one was watching closely enough to notice. I realized something uncomfortable. The game wasn't perfect. It never had been. It functioned because most people agreed to pretend it was. That realization hit harder than hunger ever had. Because innocence isn't lost when you break a rule. It's lost when you realize how fragile the rule always was. I felt pride tighten in my chest. The kind that tells you you're better than this, that you don't need to become what you're observing, that you can win without compromising yourself. But pride doesn't pay for mistakes. And fear doesn't keep you warm at night. As the pot grew and the tension thickened, the opportunity revealed itself. Quietly, almost politely. A moment so small it would have passed unnoticed if I hadn't already been listening so closely. Nothing dramatic. No grand betrayal. Just a fraction of a second where the world seemed to hold its breath. I remember thinking, this is it. Not the act. The decision. Everything before that moment felt like preparation. Everything after would be consequence. My heart didn't race. That was the most unsettling part. Fear usually announces itself loudly. This felt controlled, calculated, like stepping onto thin ice, not because you slipped, but because you tested it first. Pride fought back one last time. If you do this, you can't undo it. If you do this, you become someone else. Necessity answered with silence. And silence won. The movement was small. Almost accidental. The kind of thing that could be explained away if questioned, or missed entirely if no one wanted to see it. It didn't feel like theft. It felt like correction, like aligning the world slightly closer to what it already was. That's the lie that makes it possible. I didn't look around. I didn't hold my breath. I let the moment pass as if nothing had happened, because to hesitate would have meant admitting what I'd done. The hand continued. The cards fell. The room stayed quiet. No one said a word. And in that silence, I felt something break, not loudly or completely, but enough to matter. It wasn't guilt. Not yet. It was innocence realizing it wouldn't be coming back. Because here's the truth, no one prepares you for it. The first time you cross a line, the world doesn't end. The table doesn't explode. The men don't stand up. The city doesn't punish you immediately. Everything continues. And that's what makes it dangerous. The game rewarded me. Not with celebration, with confirmation. Confirmation that adaptation worked. That survival didn't require permission. That the rules were less solid than they pretended to be. As the chips moved, I felt pride twist into something unfamiliar. Not triumph. Awareness. The kind that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. I had done it. And nothing had stopped me. But as the night stretched on, I felt eyes linger longer than before. A pause in conversation. A look held half a second too long. Not accusation. Curiosity. Someone was thinking. Someone was recalculating. Because when innocence leaves the table, it doesn't disappear quietly. It leaves a shadow. And shadows attract attention. I stacked my chips carefully, deliberately, as if the way I handled them could erase what had happened, as if composure could restore something already gone. It couldn't. The conflict wasn't over. It had just changed shape. Fear didn't vanish, it evolved. Pride didn't die, it adapted, and necessity took a seat beside me and stayed. I knew, even then, that this moment wasn't the climax. It was the opening move. Because cheating once doesn't make you reckless. It makes you visible. And somewhere at that table, someone had noticed the shift, not the act, but the man capable of it. That's when I understood the real danger. Not that I had crossed the line, but that the line had noticed me crossing it. The moment didn't arrive like thunder. It arrived like a held breath. Time didn't stop, it narrowed. The room didn't fade, it sharpened. Every sound grew thinner, more precise, as if the world had decided to whisper instead of speak. The cards felt heavier in my hands. Not physically, emotionally, like they carried more weight than paper ever should. The felt beneath my fingers was worn smooth by years of secrets, lies, and near misses. A surface that had seen men win fortunes and lose themselves, all without raising their voices. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had imagined shaking, imagined panic crawling up my spine, imagined the sudden heat of fear exposing me, but none of that came. My pulse slowed instead, my breathing evened out. The body adapts faster than the conscience. Around the table, no one spoke. Silence isn't empty in moments like this. It's full, dense with expectation, with calculation, with men quietly measuring each other's worth. I could hear the hum of the lights overhead, the faint clink of a glass being set down somewhere behind me. Smoke hung in the air like a held secret. This was the moment. Not the act itself. The commitment to it. Perception stretched. Seconds felt like minutes. I noticed details I'd never seen before: the small tear in the felt near the dealer's wrist, the faint stain on a man's cuff, the way another player's jaw tightened just slightly as the pot grew. I wasn't nervous. I was focused. That's the part no one warns you about: how wrong feels when it doesn't feel wrong at all. When crossing a line feels less like a leap and more like a step you've already practiced in your head. The movement was minimal, almost invisible. A shift so small it could be denied even by the person who made it. No sudden motion, no dramatic pause, just a decision executed with calm precision. The table didn't react. No sharp intake of breath, no startled glances, no sense of danger snapping shut around my wrist. Nothing. The hand continued as if the universe itself had agreed not to comment. That's when I understood something unsettling. The game wasn't watching me. It trusted me. And trust, I realized, is the most exploitable thing at the table. When the cards fell, the outcome arrived without ceremony. Chips moved toward me with a soft, almost apologetic sound. No one protested. No one questioned. The dealer didn't look up. The men across from me didn't change their expressions. I had won. And the room didn't care. There was no rush of triumph, no surge of relief, no urge to smile or breathe easier. If anything, the opposite happened. A quiet heaviness settled in my chest, like realization sinking deeper than emotion ever could. I felt aware of how easily the world had shifted, aware of how little resistance there had been, aware of how fragile the rules truly were. The win didn't feel earned. It felt revealed, as if I had pulled back a curtain and seen the machinery behind the illusion and realized it wasn't guarded nearly as well as everyone pretended. I looked around the table then, really looked. These men weren't fools. They weren't careless. They were experienced, disciplined, alert. And still, it had worked. Not because they were weak, but because they were human. The silence stretched, but it wasn't tense anymore. It was neutral, indifferent. The game had accepted the result and moved on, unconcerned with the path that led there. That was the true climax, not the win. The understanding that it hadn't required brilliance, that it hadn't demanded boldness, that it hadn't even needed courage. Just observation, timing, and the willingness to stop pretending the rules were sacred. I stacked the chips slowly, deliberately, as if taking my time could somehow rewind the moment. Each chip clicking into place felt louder than it should have, echoing in my head long after the sound faded. No one congratulated me. No one accused me. Life continued. And that continuity terrified me more than any confrontation could have. Because consequences, I realized, don't always arrive immediately. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they follow. Sometimes they watch quietly, learning your habits the same way you learned theirs. As the next hand was dealt, I felt different. Not powerful. Exposed. The illusion of innocence had been protecting me, and now it was gone. In its place stood something colder. Competence without morality. Awareness without restraint. I hadn't just changed the outcome of a hand. I had changed my relationship with the game. I knew then that I would never sit at a table the same way again. That every shuffle, every pause, every glance would now carry a second meaning. That once you learn how easy it is, you can't unlearn it. The danger wasn't addiction. It was familiarity. How quickly the extraordinary became normal. How fast the impossible turned mundane. How silence, once terrifying, became comforting. As the night wore on, I noticed something else, subtle, but unmistakable. The room felt attentive. Not suspicious, not hostile. Observant. As if the table itself had leaned in just slightly. Curious about the version of me that had just revealed himself. Curious about what I would do next. That's when the weight truly landed. I hadn't crossed a line into chaos. I had stepped into a system that now recognized me as someone capable of bending it. And systems don't forget that. The wind sat heavy in my pocket as I stood up. Heavier than any loss ever had. I didn't feel victorious walking away. I felt marked, not visibly, not immediately, but unmistakably. Outside, the air felt colder than before, sharper. The city hummed with its usual indifference. Neon lights buzzing softly in the distance, rain beginning to mist the pavement. Everything looked the same. And yet nothing was. Because the scariest realization wasn't that I had cheated. It was how easy it had been to do it, and how little the world had pushed back. That's when the question finally formed, quiet but unavoidable. If it was this easy once, what would stop me next time? And more importantly, who was already watching, wondering the same thing? Stay with me. Because the next moment isn't about whether I cheat again. It's about who noticed I already had. I believed I had gotten away with it. That's the lie I told myself as I stepped away from the table, as I felt the weight of the chips in my pocket, as I breathed the cooler air outside, and let my shoulders relax for the first time that night. Nothing had happened. No accusations, no sudden tension, no hands grabbing my collar or voices calling me back. The city went on breathing. And for a few minutes, that was enough to convince me the moment had passed, that the line I'd crossed had vanished behind me, erased by motion and time. That's when I noticed him. He wasn't close. That's what made it worse. He stood near the edge of the room, half lit, half forgotten, the kind of man your eyes slide past without registering, like furniture that's been there too long to question. He hadn't spoken, hadn't played, hadn't even sat down. He had watched. At first, I thought it was coincidence, a trick of hindsight. When you do something wrong, your mind starts inventing witnesses to punish you for it. I told myself that's all this was, paranoia dressing itself up as intuition. But then our eyes met. Just for a moment. And in that moment, something settled uncomfortably in my chest. He wasn't angry, he wasn't suspicious, he wasn't impressed. He was curious. Not the casual curiosity of a bored onlooker, but the focused, deliberate attention of someone committing a detail to memory. His expression didn't change when we locked eyes. He didn't look away quickly, embarrassed or startled. He held the look. Not long enough to be rude. Not short enough to be accidental. Long enough to tell me he had seen something. That's when the room felt smaller. I broke eye contact first, pretended to check my jacket pocket, adjusted my posture, gave myself something to do with my hands. When I looked back, he was gone, or at least no longer where he'd been. The absence was louder than his presence. I told myself it meant nothing. That people watch poker games all the time. That not every glance carries meaning. That I was projecting guilt onto a stranger because it was easier than admitting I was scared. And for a while, that story worked. I walked, I ate, I slept. Life continued. But something had shifted. I began noticing looks I hadn't before, glances that lingered a beat too long, silences that felt weighted, conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Nothing obvious, nothing provable. Just patterns. The same way I used to notice tells. That's when it hit me. Once you train yourself to see, you don't get to choose what you notice anymore. The realization didn't arrive with panic. It came quietly, like a thought you don't want to finish, because you already know where it leads. I hadn't been the only observer at that table. I had been evaluated. Poker players watch hands. Predators watch people. And that man, he hadn't been watching the cards. He had been watching me. I replayed the moment over and over in my head. The angle of his body, the stillness of his posture, the way his eyes hadn't flickered when the chips moved my way. Most men react to winning. Even when they lose, there's a reflex annoyance, resignation, calculation. He had shown none of it. He had been studying continuity, behavior. The kind of man who doesn't care about outcomes, only about what they reveal. That's when I understood the twist I hadn't seen coming. Getting away with it isn't the same as escaping consequences. Sometimes, the consequence is being remembered. And memory is the most dangerous currency on the road. I started asking myself questions I hadn't asked before. Not did I cheat, but who noticed? Not was it worth it, but what does that make me now? Because the line between survivor and liability is thinner than people think, and once you cross it, other players start deciding whether you're useful or disposable. Here's the part I won't answer for you. Put yourself there. Hungry, alone, running out of options. You see a way to survive? Quiet, clean, deniable. Do you take it? Do you choose honor and risk disappearing? Or survival and accept that someone, somewhere, may never forget your face? I'm not asking you to judge me. I'm asking what you would have done. Because the road doesn't care about intentions, and the game doesn't forgive hesitation. I told myself I'd be more careful next time. That I'd keep my head down. That I'd move on before patterns formed. But that belief lasted exactly as long as it took for me to realize something else. If one man noticed, others could too. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't watching to punish me. Maybe he was watching to decide whether I was worth approaching. That thought followed me longer than the guilt ever did. Because guilt fades. Interest doesn't. The night I cheated, I believed I had taken control of my fate. Now, wasn't so sure. Because somewhere in Oklahoma City, a man I didn't know had filed my face away under a category I couldn't see. And once that happens, the game stops being random. Stay with me. Because the next moment isn't about the cards. It's about why that man reappears, and what he wants in return for his silence. I left Oklahoma City before dawn. Not because I was chased out. Not because anyone told me to leave, and not because I felt unsafe. I left because staying felt worse. There's a kind of danger that announces itself: raised voices, slammed doors, footsteps behind you in the dark. And then there's the danger that feels polite, quiet, patient. That was the kind I felt as I packed my things, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the key with hands that no longer shook. The engine coughed, then settled into a low, familiar hum. The road ahead was empty, stretched thin under pale morning light. Everything looked clean, innocent, like the night before hadn't happened at all. That's the lie the road tells you. It lets you believe that motion equals escape. As I drove, I told myself a new story. I told myself I had learned something valuable, that I was smarter now, sharper, less naive. I told myself that the world hadn't punished me because the world understood, because survival requires flexibility, and flexibility isn't the same as corruption. I told myself I had adapted. And for a while, that story held. The money I'd won bought me time, food, gas, a few nights where sleep came easier than it had in weeks. The immediate pressure lifted, and with it came a dangerous sense of validation. Nothing bad had happened. That's the moment that changes you, not when you do the wrong thing, but when you get away with it. Because the lesson you learn isn't don't do this again. It's this works. I didn't feel like a villain. I didn't feel powerful. I felt capable, like I had unlocked a door I hadn't known existed and stepped into a wider version of the world. That's the part no one warns you about. Winning doesn't feel like victory. It feels like exposure. Because once you see how thin the rules are, you start noticing how often they're bent by everyone, everywhere, all the time. You realize that most people aren't moral because they're good. They're moral because they've never needed not to be. The road doesn't offer that luxury. The road strips you down to what you're willing to do when no one is watching, or worse, when someone is watching and you choose to act anyway. I thought cheating had made me stronger. What it actually did was teach me the wrong lesson. It taught me that lines move, that silence equals consent, that consequences are optional if you're careful enough. But the road doesn't forget faces. That truth reveals itself slowly. At first, it's subtle, a familiar look in a room you've never been in, a pause in conversation that lasts just a beat too long, a name spoken with curiosity instead of recognition. I noticed it weeks later, then months. Men who didn't ask where I'd learned to play, only where I'd played before. Tables where I was welcomed too easily. Games that felt arranged before I ever sat down. At the time, I thought it meant reputation. Now, I know it meant memory. That man in Oklahoma City, the one who watched too closely, he didn't confront me, didn't threaten me, didn't expose me. He did something far more effective. He remembered me. And memory travels faster than a man ever could. I tell you this, not to confess but to warn. Because the road doesn't punish you immediately. It waits until you've built an identity around the lesson you learned, until you've trusted it, relied on it. Only then does it decide whether you're a liability or an asset. As I crossed state lines, the sun finally broke over the horizon, lighting up the highway in pale gold. It should have felt like a beginning. Instead, it felt like continuation. I wasn't running anymore. I was being carried. Carried by a decision that no longer felt like a single moment, but like the first step in a longer conversation hadn't agreed to join. That's the unsettling truth about winning the wrong way. You don't leave it behind. It walks with you, sits with you, listens quietly while you convince yourself you're in control. And one day, when you least expect it, it speaks. I thought I had outgrown fear. What I hadn't realized was that fear had simply changed shape. It wasn't loud now. It was patient. So when I tell you I left Oklahoma City believing I was smarter, understand what I mean. I was smarter about cards, smarter about men, smarter about how the game actually worked. But I was dangerously ignorant about one thing. Some wins don't close doors. They open them. And once they're open, you don't always get to choose who walks through. That's why the story doesn't end with punishment. It ends with anticipation. Because the next time I saw that man, or someone very much like him, I wasn't accused. I wasn't hunted. I was invited. Now, I want to hear from you. Answer these exact questions in the comments. Question 1. Would you cheat if losing meant sleeping in your car? Question 2. What city are you watching from right now? I read every comment. If this story pulled you in, leave a like, it tells the platform this journey matters, and subscribe to the channel if you want to continue down this road with me. Because next time, I wasn't hunted. I was invited.